Welcome to this Theology Matters course called Gospels in Comparison. This is session 1, and in it we'll begin to explore the central question of the course, and it's namely this. How are each of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, how are they related to one another? While the broad contours of the story that we know about Jesus' life and teachings, and ultimately Jesus' death and resurrection, while the broad contours of that story are echoed in a very similar fashion in each of the 4 canonical Gospels that we have, those Gospel accounts of that Jesus story are not identical. That is, they don't all say the same thing, nor even in the same way. They each have their own distinctive styles, concerns, theological interests, audience, setting. They all have all of these distinctive features. Now, to use a metaphor, we might say something like the Jesus story, that story that we know and believe in, that story that is at the heart of our faith, that Jesus story does not come to us in the form of a single one-note song. That Jesus story comes to us in the form of a hymn in a 4-part harmony, where each of the voices of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each of those voices strikes different tones, or strikes different notes, I should say, within the same chord. The goal of this class, then, if I can just sum it up so simply, is to try to listen in to those single voices, to try to listen in to the voice of Mark, as opposed to Matthew, Luke, and John, to note their pitch and texture, and to hear them as discrete melodies. This way of listening to the Gospels, I have to say, is actually not very common. Because how do we normally interact with the Gospels? Well, we typically kind of take all of their details and we smush them all together into one unified Jesus story. To use another metaphor, I call it gospel smoothie. Okay, so you think of Mark as banana and Matthew as strawberry and John as pineapple and Luke is mango. Well, we take all of those kind of separate fruits, right? We throw them into the blender, we hit go, and in 20 seconds, we have the gospel smoothie of the Jesus story, right? It's all in there, right? If you squint, you can maybe see pieces of strawberry or something like that, but it's just this one blended story, right? I think this is what we typically do. Whether in seminary classes or in Sunday school classes, we have this blender effect in terms of how we interact with the Gospels. And I want to give you kind of two lines of evidence or maybe 2 implications of the gospel smoothie that we create. First is the fact that because we blend the Gospels into one uniform smoothie story, our knowledge of each individual gospel tends to be rather limited, right? So because we've already blend things together, we don't really know what the banana tastes like. This metaphor is going to begin to break down, but you get where I'm headed with this. So, for instance, here's a little pop quiz. Again, not graded per se. Jesus always knows how you do, but I won't be grading it. So I'm going to give you 3 different stories that only occur in one of the Gospels. Okay, a lot of stories occur in multiple Gospels, but some stories only occur in one of the Gospels. So let's see how well you do. Peter walking on water, right? You all know that story, that Peter walks on water. In what Gospel? It only occurs in one Gospel. Does anyone know which Gospel that occurs in? These are tricky, by the way. This is kind of like trivia night Bible sort of questions. So look, let's just say this. You have a 25% chance. If you say James, don't say James. James is not one of the Gospels. So if you say one of them, there's a decent chance you're going to be correct. Okay, Matthew. Whoever said Matthew, you got it. Right on. And I know that wasn't a guess, but you absolutely knew that was Matthew. Okay, how about this one? Jesus turning water into wine. That's John. Yeah, sometimes that's a little bit more memorable. And then finally, what about the Good Samaritan? Good Samaritan is in Luke, so we actually did pretty good on this quiz. So my point here is not that we need to walk around as Christians knowing, the chapter and verse of every single story. That to me, that has it's nice if you know it, but it's not essential. The question I want to ask in this course is, why is it that Luke alone has the story of the Good Samaritan? right? A lot of us know the story of the Good Samaritan. Its message is going to matter no matter if it was in Matthew or Mark or John or Luke. But there's a reason it's in Luke. Or I should say, the fact that it's in Luke reveals something about what Luke is up to, what Luke cares about, how Luke is trying to shape our understanding of Jesus. And it's not the same. This is the big spoiler alert of this class. What Luke is trying to say about Jesus, the portrait he's trying to give us about Jesus, it's not the same as Matthew and as Mark and as Luke, and as John, excuse me. And I think there's something to be learned in our life of faith by figuring out, what did Luke want to present? Why did he give us the Good Samaritan? And so on and so forth. So these are the sorts of things that we're going to address. It's not just going to be Bible trivia, but this is one example where we're working with a smoothie. The other example of where we're working with a smoothie, and it's probably the most common one, and we just did it a couple months ago, is the nativity scene, right? You all know of the nativity scene. We have a huge one in my own home, which I'll say more about in a second. But our nativity scenes that we typically work with are a wonderful smoothie blend, right? It's multiple stories combined. Now, here's the first question. Not all of the Gospels tell the story about Jesus' birth. There are two that tell the story of Jesus' birth. Does anyone know what the two are? Which two of the four tell the story of Jesus' birth? Matthew and Luke. Okay, that's pretty good, right? We take Matthew and Luke, though, again, we hit blend, and out comes the standard nativity scene. So what I want to do, just for a second as an exercise, is I want to pull the smoothie apart. I don't think you can pull a smoothie apart, but I want to try to separate the different juices from the smoothie. So first off, what do we see here? What are we looking at? What are some of the elements that stand out to you? Okay, you see we have a star. We have some shepherds, these folks over here. We've got the manger stable type thing here. Who are these guys? Yeah, the wise guys. The wise men. We've got Mary and Joseph, of course. We've got some animals. We've got a camel. I'm going to say something about the camel in a moment. So there are the elements. Now, which of those elements goes with which gospel? Here you have a 1 in 2 chance because there's only 2 of them that report the story. So what about, let's start with the wise men. Where do they come from? Anyone know? They're Matthew. Only Matthew has the wise men. And we'll kind of say more about why this is later in the course. What about the star? That's also Matthew because the star goes with the wise men. That's what directs them to the place where Jesus is born. Okay, so they kind of go together. What about the shepherds? Sorry, I'm clicks behind here. Shepherds are Luke, right? Shepherds are kind of take the place of the wise men in a certain way in the Gospel of Luke. But here in the nativity scene, again, they're all together around the same scene. What about the angel? Luke, any other answers? They're actually, so this one's funny. The angel is in Luke and in Matthew, but it's actually more complicated than that. There are 2 angels in Luke, and there are 2 angels in Matthew, and none of them are the same angels. So there's actually 4 angels, and here they actually get conflated as one. So who are the angels? Thanks, Mike, for asking. Well, in Luke, there's an unnamed angel who appears to the shepherds saying, "Do not be afraid, for see, I am bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is the Messiah, the Lord." But earlier in Luke, there's another angel, maybe it's the same angel, we don't know. There's the angel Gabriel who visits Mary. So that's Luke's 2 angels. Now what about Matthew's 2 angels? Well, there is an angel early on in Matthew's scene who appears and gives the announcement that Jesus is going to be born, but he doesn't appear to Mary. Who does he appear to? To Joseph. So why does Matthew have the angel appear to Joseph while Luke has the angel appear to Mary? We'll talk about that specifically later in this course. There is a reason. And then actually in Matthew, there's a second angel, and it's the angel that once again comes to Joseph. So Joseph gets 2 angels in Matthew. He comes again, but this time it's after the visit of the wise men, and the second angel tells Joseph to take his family and flee to Egypt because Herod had made this decree that he was going to kill kind of the young boys in the area. So actually 4 angels get blended into one in this case. Okay, a couple other quick ones. What about the building in the background? What is that? That's an inn. This is obviously not historically accurate. This would not have been what the inn looked like. The inn only appears in Luke. What about this thing here? It's a manger. Believe it or not, that only occurs in Luke as well. Matthew calls the place where Jesus is born a house. Maybe it's the same thing. Maybe it's the same way of referring to the same place. I'm not sure. Now, what about the camel? This is for 38 bonus points, all in heaven, of course. What about the camel? What gospel does the camel come from? None of them. Exactly right. Our smoothie effect is actually going to scoop up another passage. In fact, nothing from the New Testament. The camel comes from the book of Isaiah. Sorry, I'm a couple clicks behind again. A multitude of camels shall cover you. The young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense and shall proclaim the praise of the Lord. In context, Isaiah is talking about nations and gifts streaming to Jerusalem at the end of the exile. But here, this is applied to the nativity scene. Why? What's the connection to the nativity? Why would you want to put a camel there? What's the point of connection? The reference to the gifts that the wise men bring. So there's this reference to gold and frankincense, and so the nativity creators say, that must be referring to the wise men who come and visit Jesus. So here, an Old Testament text is thrown into the blender and is mashed up into this composite nativity scene story. Now,
where'd the donkey come from?
The donkey is a good question. I don't know if the donkey is just part of the kind of the set scene with the shepherds. It's unclear to me where the donkey comes from. I'm more certain about the camel than the donkey. And I assume the little sheep things. You can tell I'm really good with animals. The sheep-like things there, the four-legged creatures there, are just part of the paraphernalia that go along with the shepherds. Possibly. I don't think off the top of my head that there is reference in that part of the Gospels to Mary riding a donkey. But we do know that, of course, that Mary and Joseph travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem for the birth. So how'd they get there? Well, horse, donkey, maybe they walked. So that's a great idea that perhaps it's from there. So why are we doing all of this? So what? Well, I don't mean in any way to be critical of nativity scenes. I love nativity scenes. We have this huge one at our own home. My wife and I do. In fact, it's massive. I work with the Bible for a living. I have no idea who half the creatures and figures are in this nativity set. So much so that this year when I was installing our Christmas tree, I accidentally knocked the nativity set and poor Joseph fell to the ground and shattered on our fireplace. But because we had so many extra characters, I just moved another guy in. And you could never tell the difference. So sometimes it's helpful to have a couple extra guys around as part of this smoothie thing. It makes it all work. So no criticism of nativity scenes. And I don't even mean to be critical in any way of this way of reading, of kind of taking the Gospels and smushing them together into one account. In fact, there's really a lot of ample precedent for this way of reading Scripture. Early in the 2nd century, in fact, as early as the 2nd century, or on 160, a Christian thinker named Tatian actually writes a letter in which he talks, it's called the Diatessaron, and he actually writes a letter and describes, I'm a step ahead, in the 2nd century, Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trypho, he's trying to recount the story of Jesus' birth, and he does exactly what our nativity scenes does. He just basically takes some from Matthew, takes some from Luke, and says, yeah, here's how the Savior was born. It's all of this. It's not either or, it's all of the above. So it's already happening. This is not a new invention. What I wanted to say is that in addition to what Justin Martyr does, there is this longer tradition and robust tradition in church history of producing what are called gospel harmonies. And typically the way these gospel harmonies work is that you compile all of the details of the Gospels into a continuous narrative. So you don't just do it for the nativity scene, you actually do it for the whole life, death, and resurrection of Christ. And people would actually produce these volumes. This one is from the mid-2nd century. It's called the Diatessaron, and that just means through the four. dia through, tesseron related to four. This means like through the four Gospels. It's a way to kind of put everything together and have a nice story. And these Gospel harmonies used to circulate with the individual Gospel accounts. So you kind of had your four Gospels, but then you had this nice synopsis of things. So the church was just doing this. This was a way of reading. John Calvin, interestingly enough, has his own Gospel harmony. In the 6th century, or 16th century, he does kind of the same thing. He takes all the details of the four Gospels. Calvin only uses Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I'll say more about why he doesn't use John and his Gospel harmony in just a moment. But all this is to say that there's ample precedent for reading this way. And here's what I want to do. I actually want to get you all talking about this for a little bit. These are kind of two historical reasons why we can read the Gospels this way. But I thought we would do our TAPS exercises for those who are new. TAPS stands for Talking Aloud Partner Sharing. It's a way to get folks kind of talking amongst themselves as part of the learning activity. So here's your TAPS exercise assignment. And just take 2 or 3 minutes for this. Turn to a partner at your table and just reflect on this question. What are the advantages of harmonizing, or if you would rather, smoothieizing, the four Gospels into a singular life of Jesus? Why would we do that? What's valuable, or what's the advantage of doing so? So talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll come back together and report back on what you found. Okay, friends, let me invite you back together. I know there's probably more to be said on this topic, and I'm sorry to cut your conversations a little bit short, but I would love to hear from some of you. What are some of the advantages of doing precisely what we tend to do with the Gospels, that is, combine them all together into one? What are some advantages? Sure. Go Bruce here, and then we'll come over to you, Margaret.
We're wondering if maybe these Gospels grew up in different communities,
Okay.
and therefore they didn't communicate because you're way over there and you can't get them published, and so everybody has the same thing. So if you eventually blend the story, so one thing leads to the next, to the next, to the next, then everybody is able to hear all the stories that were originally in. I don't know. It's just
So you actually get the benefit of hearing a bunch of different perspectives kind of all together at once. If I'm hearing you right. Yeah, that's good. And Margaret, do you want to?
Ours was very similar. David pointed out that it really gives the whole picture, and it hardly matters if one doesn't have an angel or a star.
That's right, because we still know that story through all four Gospels in that sense. Yeah, I like that a lot. Thank you. Any others? I will call on you if you make eye contact with me. I feel like that's like equivalent to raising hands. So start looking away a little bit.
Well, it sort of compresses the time because the wise men didn't come until Epiphany,
Yeah.
apparently, and so gathers everyone in to about the same time.
That's like a little snapshot, right? It kind of is like a freeze frame that kind of puts everything together for us. I like that a lot. Was there another hand?
I would say that we said it was going to be so much simpler if you're teaching somebody for the first time what was Jesus all about, to tell one story rather than saying, well, there's four stories and they're a little bit different. And so that was our basic answer.
That makes sense. I'm sorry. The simplicity of it, kind of pedagogically, it's advantageous. So we have a 4-year-old or almost 4-year-old, and I mean, I think, gosh, if I had to teach him this stuff, I want to teach him this stuff, it would be easier to say, yeah, this is how the birth of Jesus went, and it's not critical for Leo to know that the shepherds are only in Luke, right? I mean, maybe that comes later, but yeah, there's a certain pedagogical simplicity to kind of putting it all together. So, and I affirm all of that, and I think it's great. So why are we going to spend a couple weeks pulling apart the smoothie? Well, I want to, despite these, to me, obvious advantages, and I hope that you still read the Gospels in that same sort of harmonizing way at the end of this course. I'm not trying to talk you out of that. But despite these advantages, I do think that there is good reasons for Christians to be aware, at least, of the distinctives of each of the Gospels. And at least as an exercise on occasion to think about the Gospels individually as opposed to the Gospels kind of summarized together. And I want to highlight for us as we kind of begin to work towards the conclusion of this first session 3 reasons why I think, despite the advantages of harmonizing, it still is worth to listen in to those four distinct voices that the gospel writers give us. First, from a historical perspective, and what a few of the responses already got at this, but from a historical perspective, we must acknowledge that the gospel accounts as we have them today were not written to be circulated as a fourfold collection. So there's this great image here from the 17th century where you have the four gospel writers kind of huddled around a book. I'm not sure if that's the Old Testament or something like that, but it's clear here that all the gospel writers are together, and they might even be collaborating on the story. That didn't happen. It's a great image, but it didn't happen. Historically, these authors were separate, and I'll say more about who they are in our next session. They didn't work for the same publisher or publishing house. They were independent works. And in fact, there might even be a hint in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke that some of these Gospels were in competition. That is, they were written, one was written in order to replace the others, not, in fact, to go along with the other. So in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, Luke is dressing his kind of theoretical listener, Theophilus, who might have been a real person, but Theophilus means God lover, so that just could be anyone who reads his gospel. So Luke says this: since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, that is, since many other people have tried to write a gospel, just as they were handed on to us by those from the beginnings were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Now, I think I'm reading a little bit subsurface, but I'm wondering if Luke is saying, yeah, you know the other Gospels, but I've investigated carefully, and here is my account. Luke might be aware of other Gospel writers. We'll say more about that in our second session as well. But he's not thinking that his account is going to be circulating with three others. That's not his understanding here. And from a historical perspective, that didn't happen. For very practical, technological reasons, the technology to bind manuscripts into what we know as a book, it's called codex technology, that was only just beginning to be developed in the first century CE. So even if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did work together, they worked for the same publishing house, there really wasn't the technology available to bind them all together and to circulate them. So that very likely did not happen. And even if you could do that, back then, copies of texts like this would have been exceedingly expensive, and it's very unlikely that the sort of Christian communities that were beginning to emerge in the first and second century, which were kind of on the margins of society, more or less, that they had the money to afford all of the Gospels. So it's very likely that you could have had David's church had the Gospel of Matthew because that's what David's church could afford, right? And Jack's church had the Gospel of Luke because that's what they could afford. And so it's just, we need to imagine the early church not having these four Gospels together. It wasn't like they made an intellectual choice not to harmonize the Gospel. They just didn't have the Gospels all together. And it would be instructive just to kind of imagine, like, well, what would you be like as a church if all you knew about Jesus was the Jesus that Matthew gave us? And what would you be like as a church if all you knew about Jesus was the Jesus Luke gave us? I think those churches would be a little bit different. Not profoundly different, I should say, but I think they'd be a little bit different. So historically, this happened. In fact, it really wasn't until about the 8th century CE, so about 800 years after the time of Jesus, that kind of gospel books, collections of the four Gospels, began to circulate together. One of the earliest is called the Gospel Book from the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland. It's one of the earliest copies of these gospel books that we have. For the First Pres listeners who did our study abroad trip back in the spring, we visited the Abbey of St. Gall. If you remember, there was a wonderful library there. That's where this book would have been stored. So those of you who traveled with us, at least were in that place where this gospel book was found. So at the very least, we need to acknowledge that for at least 600 or 700 years, the church didn't have a fourfold gospel. It just didn't exist. So that's number one reason why I think it can matter to listen into the gospel separately. The second reason is that the church has always had a deep appreciation for what makes the Gospels distinct. This isn't a new thing that we're trying to teach. We're actually just trying to connect back to a tradition in the church that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, this is nowhere more evident than in the early tradition of associating the Gospels or the Gospel writers literally with different creatures or with different faces. Has anyone seen ever an image like this where one Gospel writer is described as an eagle, another as a lion, another as a human, and another as a lamb? Is this familiar? Have you all ever seen some association like that? So there's 4 creatures that the Gospels get associated with. Again, a lion, a human, a lamb, and an eagle. Does anyone know which is which? Again, just for the purpose of Bible trivia, does anyone know which is which? Mark is the lion. John is the eagle. Luke is the lamb. And then that leaves Matthew as the human. Now, where does this imagery come from, and why would they choose them for these individual Gospels? Well, I'm really glad Adele asked that question, because here's where it comes from. There's 2 potential sources, and they kind of build off one another, one from the Old Testament, one from the New. In the Old Testament, in the book of Ezekiel, there's this really weird scene in the beginning where the prophet has this vision of the throne of God kind of lifting up out of the temple. This is about at the fall of Jerusalem, and God's presence is going to go with the people in the exile. And the way that the prophet imagines that, he sees this throne elevate, and it's a wild thing that the throne has like 4 wheels. And within each of those wheels, there are 4 creatures with wings and eyes and faces. And it's not described what those creatures are necessarily, but there are these 4 creatures. And then on the throne is the appearance of something that looks like the form of a human. Okay? So Ezekiel has this image. And then, many, many years later, at the very end of our canon, in the book of Revelation, a similar description appears. But this time, the person on the throne is Christ. But listen to what Revelation does with that imagery. Around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures. Now, the book of Revelation is actually going to differentiate the creatures. It's not just 4 creatures, it's 4 different types. There's a lion. There's an ox. There's a face with a human face. And the 4th living creature is like a flying eagle. So, in the early church, they take this imagery and what they think is like, oh, this is the throne of Christ. And around it are 4 creatures. Those 4 creatures are the 4 gospel writers. They're all bearing witness to this image of Christ. And so each gospel writer gets associated with a creature. Why are the associations? Well, Matthew is a human because his gospel begins with Jesus' human genealogy as a Jewish man. Mark is a lion because his gospel begins with the voice of John the Baptist roaring in the wilderness. Prepare, for the kingdom of God is coming, and repent. Luke is a calf because Luke begins and ends in the Jerusalem temple, where a sacrificial lamb or calf might well be appropriate. And John the eagle soars above the other gospel writers because his gospel deals most squarely with the divine qualities of Jesus, more so than his human work. So the point of all of this is just to say that from very early on, the church understood that the Gospels had a distinctive quality, and they were actually interested in what that distinctive quality was. And I think we've lost a little bit of that along the way. Finally, let me say one last thing, and we'll bring this first session to a close. The third reason for reading the Gospel separately, is that when we harmonize, we can easily overlook that which is distinctive about each gospel. And sometimes it's in those distinctive features that the most important theological work is done. So what makes these gospels distinct? Well, at one level, it's just what's in there, content. Which stories are selected? None of the gospels give us all of it. They all select certain stories to give us, stories about Jesus, stories about the disciples. What they select actually reveals a lot about what they want to teach us about Jesus and discipleship. But even when the Gospels have the same story, they don't always present the story in the same exact way. So there are cases where Matthew, Mark, and Luke all relay the same story, but they don't do it in identical fashion. So sometimes their styles are different. The story is conveyed, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, sometimes more detail, sometimes less. The arrangement can be different. That is, a story appears in all the Gospels, but it doesn't appear in the same place. And sometimes the placement of the story matters in terms of the meaning it's supposed to convey. And sometimes there's just simple vocabulary different. We're going to keep an eye in this course on how is Jesus referred to. Is he called the Son of God, the Son of Man, Christ, prophet, king, teacher? And what's the difference? Why does it matter what Jesus is called? Jesus is all those things, but it's going to matter why he's called certain things in certain contexts. And finally, we might say that there's different points of view. There are different aspects of the story that are emphasized. We're going to see this especially with the disciples. The disciples are going to look really different in Matthew's gospel in comparison to Mark's gospel. Same disciples, but how they're presented, the point of view of the author about what it means to be a disciple is going to look very different. And I think getting those different perspectives helps us actually engage more with the theology and message of each of the four Gospels. So with all of this in view, here's what we're going to do in this course. We're beginning with this consideration of what it means to have a fourfold gospel. In our next session, we're going to kind of do a little bit of a Gospel 101, just some very basic things we need to understand about what a gospel is, where they come from, how they work, that are going to set us up for the rest of the course. And then we're going to do 3 sessions in a row where we focus on Mark, Matthew, and Luke in that order to think about some of their distinctive qualities. They will not be full-scale introductions to each of the Gospels, but I want you to walk away with some footholds and say, I know 3 or 4 things that are distinctive to Mark. So next time you hear a sermon on Mark, you can begin to think about, well, what am I hearing? How does this represent Mark's unique perspective? And we'll do the same for Matthew and Luke. And then basically in our last 2 sessions, we're going to do a couple case studies. We're just going to find cases where the same story appears in all 3 Gospels, and we're just going to read them together. And you, as participants, are going to do the work of thinking, well, what's different? And what does that difference reveal about the theology conveyed by that gospel? So those last couple sessions will really be much more hands-on. So this is where we're headed for the course. I hope that it not only helps you better understand these gospels that we dearly love, but I hope in doing so, we learn something even bigger than just knowledge about the gospels. I hope as we encounter the differences between the presentations of Jesus in our own Bible, I hope that teaches us something about how to engage difference among one another as we sit at the same table or in the same pews with different perspectives on who God is and how God relates to our lives. I hope in engaging the diversity of the Gospels, we do a better job of engaging the diversity of one another. Thank you.